Okay. Okay. All right. This is we're almost at the end of the month. We're here on the 30th of September, Saturday, here in Houston. This is a regular Saturday meeting. My name is Brian Lantz, and we'll be covering today the looming next financial crisis, and in the context of Hurricane Harvey and Irma and Maria and the earthquakes in Mexico. Obviously, a financial collapse at this point is not something to be welcome, if it ever is. And so we're going to address how do we organize a recovery, an actual recovery out of these conditions that we're already facing, which to date has not really been seriously presented by public officials, because there's a big quandary, a lack of foresight involved to date. But there's a lot going on. There's a lot cooking behind the scenes, so we'll get to that. How we organize a recovery, modeled on what was done in the 1930s by Roosevelt and his administration in particular, to give us some certain insights. First, I want to report, very importantly, and this is related, directly related, we've just released, Executive Intelligence Review magazine has just released a special dossier on Robert Swan Mueller, or Mueller III, the so-called special prosecutor, Star Chamber proceedings specialist. This dossier takes one through three crucial cases to understand what Robert Mueller is. And it starts with the Get LaRouche Task Force operation in the 1980s that started in Boston, which was under William Weld. Mueller was selected to head that operation up, which landed Mr. LaRouche and several of his associates in prison until we were able to organize his release after 5 years. It led to the bankruptcy of the Science Foundation, the Fusion Energy Foundation, which afterwards the judge in the court, afterwards I'm saying in further hearings, reversed the bankruptcy, saying that a fraud had been perpetrated on the court. And in fact, the original prosecution of LaRouche by Mueller and Company up in Boston was itself thrown out due to corruption on the part of the prosecution, and the polling of all of the jurists. They polled themselves after having heard the prosecution's case only, that if the case had proceeded, they would have all voted for acquittal. It just gives you a sense of what we're dealing with here. The second case is the cover-up of 9/11, because if you may recall, maybe not, it was Robert Mueller who had just stepped in as the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation when the assault on the Twin Towers, Pentagon, and so forth occurred in 2001. So September 11, 2001. So Mueller then proceeded to block congressional investigations into 9/11 as Senator Bob Graham of Florida, now retired, has emphasized in a series of press conferences and so on. So that material is reviewed, and that leads us then to the ongoing operation by Mueller today on the behalf of the same elites, for the same purpose, overarching purpose, to attempt to dismantle the Trump presidency and really the institution of the presidency itself. So this is now released in the EIR, but it's also available online for free to be downloaded at LaRouchePub.com. That's LaRouchePublications.com, LaRouchePub.com. That's the EIR website. It's also available on LaRouchePAC.com. So you can get your hands on this report and circulate widely. We've released this report as timely now, very timely, exactly because we have an escalating counterattack against Mueller and his Anglo-American circles. We've had the VIPS report come out showing the forensic evidence that there was no leak or excuse me, hack of the DNC computers, that this was a leak internally. And then there's been follow-up to that as well. Some of the latest is also in this issue of the Executive Intelligence Review, updated material from William Benny and McGovern. So we have that. We have Senator Grassley's efforts in the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, calling the FBI onto the carpet. We have just this last week, we had Roger Stone's testimony in closed hearings before the Congress, but he also released publicly what he presented in those hearings and went right after the whole evil charade being carried out on this Russian hack narrative, and which has targeted him as well as Trump. So these combined, along with other developments, really are beginning to roll back the attack on President Trump and the administration. And this is critical because unless we free up the presidency to effectively act on this crisis, the physical economic breakdown of our economy, to also simultaneously act to develop further the openings that President Trump has initiated with Russia and China in particular, to get us out of this endless war process. Unless that's done, we won't be here, you know. Certainly not in any recognizable form as a nation, and mankind won't be here, and that's the danger, the real danger, fundamental danger, existential danger. On the other hand, using the Mueller material now and widely circulating, and in that sense going for the jugular, means that we can break this control over the Trump presidency and orient it towards the LaRouche 4 laws solutions that are required, and we'll get into that in a minute. So with that, let me just proceed, and I'll start by going through, I want to bring up first of all Puerto Rico, just because there's so much noise about this. I mean, look, we've had a series of tremendous disasters, and man-made, really. I mean, that's really how people have to approach it from the standpoint of thinking it through. There's obviously the natural, if you will, natural disaster aspect of it, but we've got to really think this through from the standpoint of mankind's role. An effort is now underway in Puerto Rico. It's very extensive. I mean, the Air Mobility Command of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff has carried out 200 sorties. They've dropped in 1,500 short tons of critical equipment. Air traffic control services are now back on in San Juan, so more planes can come in. The Air National Guard has flown in another 213 sorties, 1,200 people. 90% of the island of Puerto Rico is now accessible. And just to give you an idea, I mean, Puerto Rico, the size of Puerto Rico is roughly the size of the Houston-Galveston area. I mean, just a rough idea, taking that area in kind of the broadest sense. But to give you an idea of what we're talking about, 3.5 million people, roughly 3.4 million people. But 90% of the island is now accessible. I think everybody knows how devastated Puerto Rico was, but now it's accessible. 44 of the 69 hospitals are up and operating, not fully operational, but they're up and operating with a great deal of help from FEMA, from the U.S. military. The Army Corps has completed a damage assessment of Puerto Rico's major dam, the one that was threatened with bursting. We heard so much about that in the media. It never burst, which was a blessing. And so now steps are being undertaken to reinforce that dam and proceed on that. A total of 10,000 U.S. Federal officers are in Puerto Rico now. That includes 7,000 plus troops. So I just want to indicate, that there is a significant operation in Puerto Rico, which parallels the efforts that were taken by the Trump administration and by the U.S. military and team agencies, and obviously also volunteers and so forth, as was done in Texas, in the context of Hurricane Harvey, and then in Florida with Hurricane Irma. So, okay, so what are we looking at then? What are we looking at? And just by the way, I mean, Secretary of State Tillerson is now in China. Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, was just there. President Trump is going to be going to Asia for 12 days, starting November 3rd. Japan, South Korea, China, Vietnam, the Philippines. International coordination on economic issues is going to be front and center. And what are we dealing with in terms of this crisis? Well, Hurricane Harvey, you probably have heard, is going to cost approximately $200 billion for recovery, just for basic recovery. No bells and whistles. Florida, the estimate, I mean, there will be bells and whistles. We'll get to the bells and whistles we need in a minute. Florida, 100 billion is the figure that's thrown around. I mean, these are just approximations, right? Puerto Rico, there's no estimate yet. They don't even have their arms around that yet in terms of what it's going to cost. Could you put up that? I think well, we have the first slide here is from this is the Barker, the berm, the so-called dam. It's an earthen dam for the Barker Reservoir there, right here in Houston, which I think everybody knows about, and how controversial the water releases were and so forth. I mean, that's not to blame the Army Corps of Engineers, but that just to say that's what we're looking at here. These dams were built in the 1940s. Go to the next dam, and we'll come back to Puerto Rico in just a second. This is the 1940s map drawn up by the Army Corps of Engineers. And off here on your left-hand side, you see the Barker and Addicks reservoirs and dams that were proposed in 1940. And then above that, you see the Cypress Creek levee as a proposal. And you see right up here. And that's where they're talking, roughly, ballpark, that's where they're talking about a new reservoir now. And here on going off to the right, above and below the actual city at that time of Houston, you see two canals that were going to run water off into the Ship Canal and then off into Galveston Bay. This is what was proposed in 1940 by the Army Corps of Engineers. Before all of that area built up. Absolutely. Before all that area built up. This is when the city was about 400,000 people. And of course that the Cypress Creek levee was never built. The canals were never built. And so that was the last major construction. While the entire, as you were pointing out, the entire city has grown up around this. So what are we talking about? Well, they're suggesting for a new reservoir. Well, that's another 400 million, roughly, give or take.
Let people build homes behind it like they did on the
yeah, right. Well, that's.
I think you said it.
Yeah. Then there's then there's the question of just channel lighting. I mean, there's you may not know, there's 2,800 plus miles of bayou running through the city. Yeah.
Give me a break.
Yeah. So the point is there's an ongoing plan, not just plan, it's underway. It's the Army Corps of Engineers plan developed in cooperation with the Harris County Flood Control District to widen all of these channels, these bayous, to move water through them faster and get them, into the ship canal and get them on out to sea. That's the $25 billion proposal that we mentioned that LaRouche had in his emergency economic program that was released immediately after Harvey hit, calling for a declaration of economic emergency. We cited a $25 billion plan, but let me make clear that $25 billion plan, widening these bayous and so forth and moving water on out, that's currently budgeted. The 2017 Harris Control Flood District, plan. They're going forward this year into next. They request from the county $200 million towards this project, and they state that in 60 years they'll be able to complete it. I'm not kidding. It's right there. I think it's the next to the last paragraph. They actually just kind of sum it up. That this is. Yeah, right. So, but I'm saying then I'm sure you know about the Ike Dike, or there's other proposals like the Ike Dike, but to build a gate, a barrier, a movable gate, I'll call it, at the entrance to Galveston Bay, to stop sea surges from coming in, and also to build a spine of berms and so forth running along the Gulf, similar to what you already have in terms of the Galveston seawall, but on an expanded basis. And that project comes in, according to the Ike Dike proposal, the figure I saw, but it's not just my figure, it's also a proposal that a number of elected officials a year ago proposed to President Trump that he support, is a $15 billion proposal. So I'm saying, okay, 200 billion, 100 billion for Florida, 200 billion for Harvey, several hundred billion for Puerto Rico, just in terms of recovery, 15 billion for the Ike Dike, 300 or 400 million for the reservoir, 26 billion for the channel operations, and then if we're actually going to build a canal, maybe not these kinds of canals, but in just to step back, in 1968, the Texas Water Plan, not kind of out of the blue, but after a great deal of study and collaboration with the federal government and Army Corps of Engineers and so forth, proposed building two channels, one from either the Missouri or Mississippi rivers on across, one a northern route that would go across to the Ogallala Aquifer in the Panhandle to recharge the aquifer, but also provide transport and water and irrigation and so forth as needed along the pathway. The other would, along what they call the coastal canal, would run from western Louisiana on over, from basically the Sabine River, on through and cut across the Texas rivers running into the Gulf, and take water as necessary all the way down to the Rio Grande. In other words, to carry off enormous amounts of water as required. And this was just part of the 1968 water plan. That went to the voters in 1969, in August of 1969, called Proposition 3. It lost. It required a constitutional amendment. It lost by 6,000 votes. 6,000 votes. So the point I'm making here is that throughout the decades, and we could get into desalinization. Governor Perry was proposing in the early 2000s, and actually the state proceeded with certain desalinization projects. down in the Brownsville area and elsewhere, saltwater desalinization plants. Again, this it's what was actually built was a fraction of what actually was being considered and discussed. Florida now needs beyond 100 billion in terms of recovery. I mean, we've talked about Houston. Florida has a tremendous saltwater intrusion problem because the freshwater table is being drawn down, because of the use of groundwater. So, well, what are they going to do? I mean, it's preventing saltwater intrusion is hard when your water tables fall. Because it's like a vacuum. Your gravity, you could say, in a certain sense, is just drawing that water in, or you can think of a dry sponge that's then just soaking in the salt water as it dries out, or would dry out. Well, desalinization plants for Florida is absolutely essential to the future of that state. There's already operating the largest saltwater desalinization plant in the country is operating in Tampa, Florida. So major investments are required in Florida because we're not just dealing with flooding or hurricanes, we're dealing with the reliability of infrastructure to deal with too much water or too little water or the wrong kind of water, right? But the question of desalinization of salt water, I mean, nobody should be going without water. I mean, it's right out there, right? It's the oceans. So desalinization obviously creates a solution. Just to mention another feature on Florida, and this obviously applies to Puerto Rico as well, the question has been raised in Florida, why not put all the power lines underground, right? Why have them on poles? Why have them on sticks? What you're looking at if you have these hanging around up there for the next storm. And then there's a proposal, I just heard briefly about it, as I think some of you did. There's a new technology, not technology, I don't want to overstate it, but it's a useful concept, which is to have power lines and so forth that collapse, that can be folded up and then restored. In other words, taken down and restored in a short period of time. Anyway, I mean, but I'm saying, if you're actually going to plan for the future, you need this kind of approach. And of course, to do these things, you need power. You need more power. So you need nuclear power. So Egypt and Russia can build 4 nuclear power plants for 25 billion, including operating them for 20 years. But we're trying to build this plant in Georgia right now, and it's going to cost 27 billion before it's even up and running. So the point here is we're going to have to cut through a lot of noise, a lot of fear, a lot of small thinking in different forms to actually move. But we're talking about trillions of dollars. Just in terms of what we're talking about here, this is only a fraction of the country in terms of what's required. So the question obviously comes up in terms of how do we actually finance this? But also keeping in mind that if we're thinking about it right, what you're going to be doing in building up this infrastructure, creating these conditions, stable conditions and so forth, for economic activity otherwise, is you're going to be increasing the creative powers, the application of the creative powers of our own people, and increasing the productivity of our economies, and these projects will pay for themselves over time. But how do you actually pay for them now, up front, so you can take gain the advantage of these projects later on? Okay, so, all right, so briefly here now on the financial crisis. On to the next one here. What do we have next? I think the next is the Puerto Rican debt. Okay, so Puerto Rico has about $70 billion in debt right now, and another $50 billion in pension obligations, roughly. These figures are kind of moving targets, but anyway, President Trump brought this up at the meeting before the National Manufacturers Association yesterday, that this is part of what Puerto Rico and the U.S. government and President Trump working with the governor of Puerto Rico and so forth, we have to work out. How do we not build this recovery for Puerto Rico, but also we got to deal with this tremendous debt. There's a lot of debt for 3.5 million people. I mean, the population of Puerto Rico is shrinking. And it's shrinking. People are leaving. It's been shrinking for years. I'm sorry? 3.4 million, roughly. Yeah. But moving on, what about the United States? This is corporate debt. That blue line going up to the right. Okay, this is Goldman Sachs. I mean, can't you trust them? They're saying in the U.S. economy, debt levels have more than doubled since pre-crisis levels. That is, since 2008. Okay, that's corporate debt. Interest rates, of course, have been kept down by the Fed almost to nothing. We'll come back to that. Go on to the next one. And this is just very briefly touching on a couple of aspects of the situation. Leveraged loans. Leveraged loans, essentially are junk loans, just like you have junk bonds. And here you see the growth of this, particularly in the U.S. in blue. Going back to 2008, you see it's a little over $100 billion in leveraged loans. And now we're up to the range of 500 billion in yearly issuances. Leveraged loans, let me just, right now, I'll just go to this quickly. There's so much that could be covered, but I want to keep things moving along here.
Those are loans to both public and private?
No, those are to companies, corporations. Not only do you have a lot of loans, companies have engaged in what's called financial engineering, right? That's the term for it, financial engineering. That's when companies buy back their own stock. It's also financing mergers and acquisitions. Both of those qualify as financial engineering, all right? So what better way for, this is Exxon, this is Apple. I mean, this is not, small companies off on the side. These companies have been spending hundreds of billions of dollars buying back their own stock to drive up the stock values in the stock market. It's a quick way of making the bottom line look good, right? Your assets are going up in value. Your stockholders are happy. And of course, most of your stockholders are institutions, or should be institutionalized, one or the other. So you're making them happy. You're making Wall Street happy. But you're borrowing money, but you're borrowing because, hey, interest rates are low. I can get the money almost for free, and I can turn around, buy my own stock, boost the stock up. And if I'm an executive, my pay is tied to the value of my stock. So, at the end of the year, I get a nice bonus. You engineer your bonuses this way, All right. So that's going on. But then you have leveraged loan operations going on. Now, this is kind of an addition, but you can see how companies that are going deeper and deeper in debt end up getting into a leveraged loan position, where their debt to equity is 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times, or, as I'll come to in a second, 7 times their equity, right? Borrowing money, to keep the Ponzi scheme, if you will, going, to keep the appearances, to put it maybe more politely, there, right? So let's take the example of a Houstonian in the news all the time. The billionaire buyer, Tillman Fertitta. You know Tillman Fertitta? Does that name ring a bell with you? Right? Landry's. right? He owns
Salt
Landry's corporate.
Grass.
Yeah, well, Landry's in terms of Morton's Steakhouse, and it owns Saltgrass, and it owns, now it's bought back Crab Shack, Pleasure Pier. I mean, there's all kinds of, and he owns the Golden Nugget, you know, in both in Las Vegas and now also in Louisiana there at Lake Charles, the Golden Nugget. They just doubled their room size or number of rooms in their hotel and so on and so on. All right, well, Tillman Fertitta, right, who came out of Galveston, I think it was his grandfather was mob connected and was tied up in the numbers racket and so forth. I don't recall the details exactly, but Tillman Fertitta is gone straight, and he's building this financial empire, and he's a billionaire, and he's just bought the Rockets, right, the Houston Rockets, for the eye-watering amount of $2.2 billion. The most anybody tried to pay for a team. Back in 1990, he attempted to buy the team. His bid was $81 million, and he was beat out by an offer of $85 million. But now he's buying it for $2.2 billion. Okay, now to do this, all right, let me just read. This is from NASDAQ.com, you know, a news service, okay? Billionaire Tillman Fertitta announced a U.S. $2.5 billion junk bond and leveraged loan deal this week to help pay for his eye-watering purchase of the Houston Rockets' storied U.S. basketball team. And it says what he owns, you know, mentions a few things that he owns, the Golden Nugget and Morton's and so forth. The financing package is part of a complex business reorganization by Fertitta, who tried to buy the team, in 1990s. Because the NBA's current team debt cap is $250 million. That is, you know, if he's going to pay $2.2 billion, he can't have more than $250 million of that in debt. The rest has got to be cash up front. Okay. So, okay, well, you know, so what does he do? Okay, he's consolidating his restaurants with his hotel businesses, which, you know, I assume includes the casinos because the hotels are all connected to casinos. And he's packaging this, right? And so he's going to refinance his existing debt. But on top of that, he's selling this new financial paper, you know, this new consolidated company, and he's going to selling new bonds, and he's taking loans, leveraged loans, selling junk bonds and leveraged loans to raise this money on these assets, and obviously implicitly on the future value of the Rockets and whatever else, right? Out of this huge chunk of money, about $2 billion, he's going to peel off 1.65 or something like that billion as a dividend payment to himself. And with that, plus, you know, whatever else, he will buy the Rockets. Now, so the question you have to ask, right, is who is crazy enough to buy this financial paper? It's refinancing existing debt and is piling new debt on top of it. And the Houston Rockets isn't even part of the equity that's going to underwrite, you know, this debt. That he's keeping that separate. That's, you know, in other words, it's treated like his personal baby or whatever. I mean,
private business.
Private business.
Right.
Yeah, and Landry's is a private equity business, right? It's not a publicly owned company. It's owned by Fertitta, and Fertitta then has his own company, you know, as kind of the mother company of this, you know, this pyramid, if you will. But here's what it says. The article says, well, while Fertitta will contribute additional assets into the new entity, total leverage is still expected to increase by a full turn to 6.5 times after the transaction is completed. And this is based on a certain calculation of documents and analyzing the performance of the restaurants and hotels, projections, including newly opened restaurants and so on. But if you don't do all the, funny money manipulation, it says without these adjustments, total leverage would be higher than about 7 times the bond documents show. 7 to 1. This is the stratosphere. I mean, this is, but what's going on? Well, you have a lot of people who do have money who are trying to make some money. You got banks and, the Fed has been pumping out cash and so forth, and it's going into what? Speculation, right? Short-term speculation, not long-term investment, short-term speculation.
Not in energy, that's
No, not into infrastructure, right? Well, you have these things called loan funds. And people put their money into a loan fund, like into a hedge fund, into a loan fund. And then the loan fund goes out there and looks for different places to buy into paper like what Fertitta's offering. And they're expecting a high rate of return, 8, 9% these days. I mean, that's a lot, in other words, the Fed's basically making money available at around 1%. But turning around on the other side and you're going for 8 or 9%. So obviously that's payment for you taking a risk, right? There's a bigger chance that this is going to blow up in your face, right? So these loan funds, are this is now billions of dollars. As the total assets and known loan funds is about 141 billion. This has just kind of been expanding in the last year or two. So this gives you a picture. The Fertitta example I wanted to use gives you an example, and then an example of what happens when it blows out. Some of you know this. Toys R Us just went bankrupt. They had a bunch of loans, what you could consider leveraged loans, which now are defaulted on. And it was expected that those loans would fall to about 40% of value. That was already kind of written in by the markets that that's what was going to happen. Well, instead, those loans dropped to 20%, in terms of value. So that's how quickly, these things can just kind of turn into fairy dust, right? So this is what you're dealing with in terms of let me just stop there. Is there any questions? Because I don't want to dwell endlessly. But do you get the flavor of this? Yes, sir. You can go on to the next one.
Infrastructure project, how Wall Street makes money from the infrastructure.
They don't. That's why they're not doing it. And that's why we have to.
Something like this, so jump bonds.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I was going to come to it a little bit later, but President Trump met this last. Here's the growth of the high yield, that is junk bond market. So here's 2008, and here it is today. I mean, just right.
wow.
So there's the leveraged loans I showed you, and now this is the junk bonds. Okay. Hedge funds. Another vehicle for financial investments. They've been closing shop. They're not making money. President Trump just the other day met with Democrats. Congressman Brian Higgins from New York and some others. And in that meeting, he said that he basically recognized that PPPs weren't going to work. Private-public partnerships, right? And the reason was what we've said all along, and there's others that have said it as well, but we've been the most clear and consistent on it, which is hedge funds, the investors into PPPs and similar vehicles, need a short-term revenue stream. That's what they're looking for in an investment into something like Fertitta is. Okay, he's going to start paying. He's going to pay 20 years now. He's going to start paying back 8, 9% interest immediately, and that'll keep coming, right? And because it keeps coming, that instrument is liquid. I may be holding that paper from Fertitta now, but I can turn it around to sell it to somebody else because it's liquid. These long-term projects, large projects, 10, 20-year projects, don't have that revenue stream until they're finished, or they may not at all. I mean, a lot of infrastructure, I mean, how do you make money out of building a sewer system? I mean, you charge everybody,
Charged by the flood.
right, but point operated. Going back to pay bathrooms, even in the homes. Yeah, right. So the benefit is easy tag, one time pay. Yeah. Joel's contribution here. Easy tag. Why didn't Wilbur Ross think of that?
The example you're giving of Tilman Fertitta, did he float junk bonds and that's how he got some liquidity? Or?
He packaged his package. I went through it quickly, but his package it combines both leveraged loan and the sale of a new issuance of bonds, which these are junk. I mean, the article didn't say they were junk.
Who buys these? Banks?
Well, as I was saying, you have you have numbers of institutions that are looking to put their money or a portion of their money into some kind of investment that gives a high yield. And so you have these loan operations I was referring to, these loan funds, which are specifically created to pull together, like a hedge fund would pull together investors into a single fund, a pile of money, which then they can use to go out and invest in things like Fertitta's operation, taking a risk, an additional risk, to get a higher rate of return.
And then don't 401ks and these other things end up investing a certain portion of theirs into these?
Yes, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Other institutional investors, because they're now required by law to give to their clients, their pensioners, whatever, the highest rate of return in terms of investment, they will, thinking that they're engaged in due diligence, will put a certain amount of their money into these kinds of speculative investments. Yeah, high yield, high risk investments. Yes. Universities, Harvard. Oh, in 2008, Harvard lost a huge chunk on their what's the term for the universities there? Endowments. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Teachers' pension was Enron.
Yes.
Brian,
Yes.
So to define leveraged loans, at what point do we call it a leverage in terms of the ratio? Like, it's normal to get loans to build, et cetera.
Well, the term leverage is used, leverage could be 0.5, leverage could be tiny, leverage could be non-existent. So leverage is used, it's a general use term. When you're junk bonds, you're getting, 5 to 1, 6 to 1, 7 to 1, you're in junk bond territory.
Right.
It varies by industry, depending on, what kind of company. I mean, in the real world, borrowing a large amount of money relative to your assets may simply indicate that you're growing very fast. You need to invest to grow, right? There's a market out there. You begin tapping that market, and you convince banks or whatever to put a size, allow a sizable loan to you, or you're able to sell bonds to raise the money to engage in that rapid expansion, which might require trucks, or power plants, or new manufacturing facilities, new floor space, new manufacturing facilities, so to tap into a growing market, right? So it varies by industry, and it varies by the context, right? How is it being used for what purpose? But here we're talking about an entirely runaway speculative process, where the only it's why isn't money being invested in steel mills? Why isn't money being invested? Why are we allowing half the country to run down, in terms of its city, well, actually 90% of the country to run down in terms of its urban infrastructure and so on? Why is this being allowed? Why isn't there investment in this in one form or another? I'll go on to the next slide. This is emerging markets. You can see their debt composition also jump. Here's 2008. It's double. Emerging markets, developing countries. Go on to the next. I mean, this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon. Here, look. What's happened? While this speculative process has been going on, what's happened to U.S. employment and manufacturing? And here we see it, right? Out here is 2008, right? Okay, but you see, this is the long haul. This is 1980, so it gives you the long haul of really the post-industrial society, right? Because beginning in 1980, that's a good year to start. That's when Paul Volcker upped the interest rates to 20%, and that shut down all investment, and led to a rapid process of decline. Now, after the crash of 2007, 2008, now we got interest rates down to 1% or thereabouts.
The biggest downturn is right with the repeal of Glass-Steagall in '99. Then it really tumbles. Yep.
Because banks went into speculation. Banks were, before 1999, under Glass-Steagall laws, banks could not engage in speculation. No more than 10%, I think is the figure, could be invested in commodities, for example. Once you took down Glass-Steagall, well, the money went where it could. Money's an idiot. Money goes for the highest rate of return. Doesn't care what it is. If you let monetarism run them up, you're simply making decisions based on the highest rate of return. And manufacturing.
You've got a couple of other factors factoring in that are not being mentioned. And that was Nixon taking the dollar off.
Oh, yes, 71. Mm-hmm.
And during Clinton's presidency, where he insisted that the banks loan money to people who were not qualified to loan money to, which created the 2000.
Yeah, I don't buy into that. I mean, I know that that's a commonly held belief, but let me just say, you can just consider what I'm saying. You can decide yourself, but that was the argument actually put forward by Goldman Sachs, by Citibank, and so forth, in the context of the financial blowout, to argue that they weren't responsible. It was these people that acted irresponsible, in these savings and loans and the individual clients and so on and so forth, and it wasn't them. So the whole argument that somehow it was the government that instigated the crisis.
No, the government didn't instigate the crisis. They just kind of manufactured around it.
Well, that's fair. I mean, the takedown of Glass-Steagall itself is a case in point. Yeah. I want to just mention China briefly here, because there's a lot of noise. I mean, it's one of these things. Deutsche Bank was just downgraded a few days ago. If you remember last week, I mentioned it briefly in introducing Joel DeJean in his presentation. I mentioned that Deutsche Bank had listed like a dozen different potential bubbles that could pop, that could trigger the whole financial crisis. One of the things that the Deutsche Bank specialists raised was the growing leverage in terms of China's economy. And this is in terms of debt, total debt, personal debt, corporate debt, government debt to GDP, which of course GDP is a funny figure itself. So, you take this as a rough figure, but again and again in the press, you follow the financial press. If you don't, that's fine. But they're saying, well, China's massively over leveraged. Their leverage is now 257.8% of GDP. In other words, the debt is twice 2.5 times more than their GDP. Well, in the United States, that same ratio is 350% of GDP. Okay, and so so there's noise being made about China. We're not building anything. Right, and that's an interesting point, because China, there's a term called built assets. China's built assets now are valued not by China, but essentially by global people that, and they make these kind of judgments. Well, it's not even, partly markets, but partly other institutions trying to, for comparison's sake, look at these things. China's built assets are now $48 trillion. That's twice that of the United States.
That's just in China.
In China.
The number again, Brian.
48 trillion. I'm sorry, it's not twice as big. It will be twice as big by 2025. In other words, in just 8 years. Right now it's 48 trillion, and current U.S. built assets is 37 trillion. That's railroads, infrastructure of all kinds, water, sewers, steel mills, Yeah. I mean, you can imagine these things are funny figures. They're not the kind of things we would use, but for comparison's sake. So when you look at China in terms of leverage, and then you look at its assets, in terms of built-in assets, built assets, and then you look at the United States with 350% of GDP in terms of its leverage debt, and then you look at that its assets are, a third less and shrinking. We just wiped out a bunch here, right? And a bunch more just got out in Florida. We're just wiped. Then you get more of a picture. So that's I just wanted to mention that in passing, so people, and then there's other funny things going on. There's Bitcoin. Just to mention. I mean, you've got. That's all right. We're not going to get into it right now. Even Diamond, right, the head of JP Morgan Chase, says that Bitcoin is just a speculative instrument. So he's trying to make himself look good, but it's true. It's like the tulip bubbles, the tulips, if you remember that. Buying and selling tulips back in the 17th century, and the speculative market on that. Okay, so in terms of, so this is a mess, and this mess is going to crash. That's the nub of it. Now we did have, just this last week, we had this very interesting event, which is that the AFL-CIO sponsored this webinar on the web. Anybody could get on and watch it, and some people. Diane was raised a point or question, or I don't know how it exactly operated, but on Glass-Steagall, on the reenactment of Glass-Steagall. So the AFL-CIO, working with Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur, right, our good friend from Ohio, and a Democrat from Ohio, and then Walter Jones, Republican from North Carolina. They organized this event with pre-recorded videos. They made pre-recorded presentations. And along with the AFL-CIO, Public Citizen, Americans Financial Reform, Nomi Prinz, other congressmen participated, including Bernie Sanders' follow-on organization, Our Revolution. So this is an escalation around the LaRouche Four Laws policy, that's coming in to play now. At this very point where the whole question of rebuilding trillions of dollars of infrastructure, and of course, why just rebuild it? Why not go to the next level? Why not build out what actually is required, a new platform of infrastructure? This is now in debate.
Webinar about Glass-Steagall?
At Glass-Steagall, yes, specifically. The webinar was an hour-long webcast on Glass-Steagall, sponsored by the AFL-CIO. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide there. Try to give you something to look at. This is the collapse of labor force participation down to, around 63%. Go ahead.
That's 63% of the possible workers?
Yeah, all possible workers in the U.S. Yeah. And, anyone between an age, I think it's 16 to 16 and up.
Can you read it? It's hard to read.
Oh, civilian labor force participation rate, U.S. Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics. And this is 2013. And so that's as far as the figures go. So,
Well, why is it so low in the 50s and 60s?
well, a lot of people work. There was a lot of people in the military. Yeah, a lot of women. Yep. And then, a lot of women were not in the workforce. So, and then it climbed, and now it's been falling. And it's not because the men are making so much on their jobs that they can allow the women to stay home and raise families. That's not what's happening in the adults. Okay, go on to the next one. Okay, so in terms of organizing recovery, this you might have seen this article in the Houston Chronicle on the 16th there. And it's on Jesse Jones, that's the guy here on your left, with Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor, and then the governor of Texas at that time, that's Allred, James Allred, the governor of Texas. What we're going to talk about, we can come back to Glass-Steagall if people have questions about it, but we're going to take a look at how we organized a recovery coming out of the last depression. And we're doing it now because Trump raised it himself. PPPs aren't going to do it. How are you going to finance infrastructure? Wall Street's not going to do it. Wall Street's actually going under. Glass-Steagall's going to have to help clean up that mess. But how do we actually organize a recovery? And this article is really worth reading and rereading because it takes you through the history of a brief history, summary history of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So let me talk about this a little bit and give you some examples of this. I have there the book, Jesse Jones, and then with a ghostwriter, $50 billion is what it's titled. It's Jesse Jones' book about his years as head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation.
That used to be a lot of money.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Well, maybe I'm going to use that a little bit here in the case. But as you know, in 1933, we had a complete bank collapse. It began in 32, really, but it spread. And so by the time President Roosevelt came in March, that's when they swore him in those days, in 1933, most of the banks had closed their doors. The whole system had frozen up. And Jesse Jones makes the point that if money had been made available sooner, if steps had been taken sooner, a lot of pain could have been avoided. But it wasn't until, and he's a Republican and not a particularly nice fellow, at least in his later years, in terms of he really looked back on his relationship with Roosevelt in a very jaundiced way. Bitter, yeah. So I don't know all what went into it, but as he said, and I'm just kind of taking this, he says a few $1 billion boldly but judiciously lent and invested by such a government agency as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in 31-32 would have prevented the failure of thousands of banks and averted a complete breakdown in business, agriculture, and industry, and so forth. Now, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation did exist. It was actually created under Hoover. But as he goes on and says, he goes on to say, the amendment to our act, that is, that created the RFC, in August 1932, gave us limited authority for financing public works, but Congress made the conditions so restrictive that not a great deal could be accomplished. Anyway, there was not time enough left before the change in administration to avert the complete crash, which culminated in the bank holiday of March 1933. It will be recalled that President Roosevelt's first act was to close all the banks until a law could be passed giving us authority to save them. An interesting way of formulating it. So what happened? Well, the action in terms of Congress first was the passage of the Emergency Banking Act in March of 1933, also referred to as the Bank Conservation Act because that was a feature of it, particularly under Title III. The Emergency Banking Act gave power, first of all, to the president, the ability to help shape monetary policy himself as the president, including gold and silver, to the circulation of gold and silver. Roosevelt was able to stop the outflow. There was a British operation attempting to drain the U.S. of its gold, which was shut down by Roosevelt. That's just as an aside. It also created under Title III, the power was given to the controller of the currency under the period of the, not just in the period of the bank holiday, which was instituted as soon as Roosevelt got in. That ran from March 5th. He was sworn in on March 4th, and it ran till it was extended and ran till March 13th. So a total of 7 or 8 days of the bank holiday. But the legislation, basically after the fact, ratified that was legal, what had just been done in terms of a declaration by the president of a bank holiday, right? And then gave power to the controller of the currency to, in those banks which were found not to be solvent, to assign a conservator to the bank, to run the bank for the duration of the problematic period, to oversee its liquidation or its reorganization or other operations. And this is the process under which these banks were cleaned out, cleaned up. Paper was written off, speculative paper that obviously could not be, just had to be, written off the books, was done. And then it was in June that the Banking Act of 1933, including Glass-Steagall, were passed. So you had the March, and then you had in June, you had the Banking Act of 1933, which established the FDIC, that is separated merchant banking from commercial banking, and all of that occurred then in that period. Now, what I wanted to get to was a feature of what, how then this process proceeded, which is the following year in 1934. Why am I jumping ahead? Well, there was immediately a rescue effort. That was begun immediately. Under the Banking Act of 1933, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and the Federal Reserve itself began to carry out operations which they had not been able to carry out until then. The problem was that even with certain, if you will, bailout operations, there wasn't lending into the economy. Yeah, there wasn't lending into the economy. They actually did, the Roosevelt administration did a poll across the country of chambers of commerce and similar organizations to actually determine what small and medium-sized companies needed in terms of lending capacity, loans. Because what they had found, what the administration had found, was that banks were okaying only about 30% of the potential lenders or borrowers that were upright companies. They were solvent companies that could be lent to. Banks were only lending to about 30% of those companies. And so they looked at this further, and they went out to these chambers, and they got back the figures, and they figured out well, we need at least 700 million, which was a lot of money in those days. You know, I mean, a rough estimate is that a dollar today is $18.75 is about what a dollar was back then. But I think that's really an understatement of the differential. But anyway, that's just on the basis of inflation. That's what's measured as inflation anyway. That's the relationship. But the so more money was required, and so what Roosevelt proceeded to do was to propose the well, let me calls it one thing first. Let me get it. He proposes the Credit Banks for Industry Act, and alongside the Federal Reserve, credit banks would be set up in each of the 12 Federal Reserve jurisdictions. You know, like we have the Dallas Federal Reserve branch here. And these credit banks would specifically lend to businesses and industry. That's what they would be set up to do. So essentially what he was trying to do was take the Federal Reserve and turn it into a credit institution. Because the Federal Reserve did not have any capacity to lend. It could not even lend to its own banks, member banks. It could discount financial paper. You know, if a bank had a mortgage out or whatever, or a large batch of mortgages and they were solvent, they could take it to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve could discount that, give them cash based on that equity, right? But if the banks didn't have any equity, they couldn't get anything discounted, right? So the Fed wasn't able to do anything, and there was no other vehicle except for the Reconstruction Finance Corporation as a potential vehicle. So in June 19th, 1934, unable to get the credit bank set up, just there wasn't the support in the Congress and so forth. What they did was pass what's called the Industrial Advances Act, June 19th, 1934, which took the Fed as well as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and gave them the capacity that he had wanted to put into these credit banks. And so at that point, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in particular starts going to town and lending massively. You know, with monies provided directly from the, authorized by the Congress, put into the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and they just started lending money right and left. Here, this is from a few chapters in the book, just to give you some idea. He says, of the 250,000 miles of railroad that interlaced the United States, more than a third went into receivership or bankruptcy during the 1930s, and another third would have, except for loans from the RFC. We loaned $1 billion to 89 railroad companies. Taken together, they own 2/3 of the nation's railroad trackage. Right? And they got their money back. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation. With interest, yes. Small amount of interest, yes.
237,000 miles of railway track.
250,000. By comparison, we're what was it? By 1970, we were down to 70,000 miles of railroad track, and now we're down to half of that. If I remember, that's approximate. What we're called buildings and loans, what is precursors of savings and loans, which have also now disappeared. We helped more than 1,100 of these associations, mostly, in that early period. Eventually, we got back the $140,158,000, which we loaned to going building and loans associations and to the receivers of some others, which had gone into liquidation. And he points out that when the RFC opened its clinic for ailing financial institutions, there were about 11 1,500 building and loans associations in the country, many of them in poor health. They had about 12 million members, many of them nearly a tenth of the entire population of the country at that time. Think of It's a Wonderful Life, if you know the movie, The Wonderful Life. That's kind of an example of a building and loan. Yeah. And this is what people, I don't know if people would put their savings into these savings and loans with the idea that then they could borrow money from the bank to build a home. And so it's this local, oriented, ground up kind of operation. So that was salvaged by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in this period. Agriculture. One afternoon in 1933, President Roosevelt called me to the White House, and as soon as I entered the room, he said, "Jesse, I want you to lend 10 cents a pound on cotton." Cotton was then selling for 9 cents. The law which created the RFE stated clearly that we should lend only to full and adequate security. So, basically, how am I going to lend for 10 cents? But the point is, they went out and created the Commodity Credit Corporation to make the market, and proceeded to build up a system. Let me see if I have
So
a
your
quote.
example is that, so the government was helping to subsidize the price the farmers would get?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that what we call parity?
Yes, this was a roundabout way of getting up to parity. This is how the RFC took its first real deep plunge into agriculture. Before we had finished helping the farmer, the jobs had become second only to our bank rescue program. We loaned money to millions of farmers. We raised the price of farm commodities and came out ahead on the books. So there's many more examples. 50 million to save one Chicago bank. Anyway, there's on and on. And then the war period, just to very briefly here, defense production. In carrying out its program, the officials, they created the Defense Plant Corporation, the government did, to build plants, because private companies couldn't build the plants that we needed to produce the war material. So they created a company to produce plants. And the former head of General Motors was put in charge of it. This is back in the day when these guys actually knew what they were doing, in terms of production. And he knew, as he said, better than anyone else, he knew how to engage a particular industry to manufacture certain war materials, to build plants to furnish arms to the British, to meet the ever-increasing demands of preparedness, et cetera, et cetera. Mr. Knutson's first office in Washington was a small one in the Federal Reserve Building with only one secretary to help him. I went there frequently to see him. His office expanded rapidly. It soon became necessary for us to have a direct telephone line from his desk to mine, at the RFC. Several times a day, he would want to talk about contracting with someone to build an air plant, that's what he calls an air plant, or an engine plant, or some other kind of plant. He would simply lift the receiver and ask me if we had 5 million or 10 million or 100 billion, as the case might be. And I always said yes. And so he said, okay. He said, I'll send a man over to see you. After negotiating with man or men and becoming favorably impressed myself, I would call Knutson back to confirm that he had felt confident the fellow or his firm were qualified to do the proposed job. If he said yes without qualification, in 9 cases out of 10, the man would leave my office after an hour or maybe 3 hours, or perhaps only a few minutes, with a letter of intent from the RFC authorizing him to acquire the necessary property and build the plant. Right?
Those are the
Yeah.
days they had actual
Yeah.
engineers.
So this was what was done under the Industrial Advances Act of June 19th, just to give you a flavor of it. Anyway, I have a copy of it. You can kind of look it over, but it's very brief. You know, it's, I mean, maybe 10 pages. But it unleashed these things.
That was the Industrial Advanced Recovery Act?
Yeah, Industrial Advances Act of 1934, June 19th, 1934, to be specific. So there's a specific section on what the Federal Reserve is then allowed to do in terms of lending directly, and what the RFC was doing. And an important aspect of it, very explicitly in the law, is that that loans should be made to companies that were already in financial trouble, to allow them to complete their production, you know, to and therefore produce what was, you know, what they were intent on producing, and therefore ultimately repay the original debt and the new lending that the RFC had made it possible. In other words, if you fixate on a debt and say, okay, you owe so much, you know, we're not lending you, you know, until you pay this off, right? You know, it's a fixation, the thing in itself, right? You're fixating on that, as opposed to saying, no, how do we make possible a process here going forward that will allow for the completion of this productive process, right? And the retirement, the liquidation of the debt, right? Self-extinguishment of the debt.
Were there any kind of measures taken to reorganize the debts of these companies so that they had a debt and they were in default, but still with this infusion by the federal government to start them on government contract, they would have to somehow work out an arrangement for ultimately paying back the original, the debt that they defaulted on. Right?
Yeah, there was a lot of different things, ways that, I don't know if this quite answers the question, I hope it does. You know, for example, the RFC bought preferred stock in companies, you know, which is a way of injecting liquidity, you know, and giving them, you know, a boost to you know, to stay solvent and continue being a productive enterprise. They did that with banks as well. So besides just loans, they also bought in, if you will, to these companies. Later, you know, liquidating their position in these companies, selling their stock. That was another feature. So does that answer?
Well, yeah, that's yeah. The kind of thing, because then they could take that money and use it straight
away. Yeah, oh, absolutely. No, and in fact, it's specifically tied. There's specific clauses that, you know, a certain amount of this money has to go to paying existing debt, that kind of thing. That helps further. Yeah.
Where did they find the people that could go into the bank and sort out what is bullshit and what's production?
Well, that's a harder job today. Then it was less trouble because more people were productively oriented to begin with. You know, it's I think that's the short answer to it.
Our companies, do they get those kind of loans that you're talking about? Because in the late 80s, car cost $10,000 and now it's costing $22,000. I think it's below the inflation rate. Cars are, I think, cheaper compared to 70s and 80s. I mean, that's just my opinion. The question is, if it is, how these car companies are doing it? Are they getting this sort of loans from banks, and as they keep on producing, they borrow more and more at low interest rates? Is that how they're maintaining?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I can answer it completely, but be aware, we've discussed it before, the rate of defaults on used cars purchased and as well as new cars is rising very rapidly. One thing that's allowed them to be able to sell cars to people, it's like the people that were buying homes that couldn't afford the payments. People are now buying cars when they don't actually have the assets, they don't have the income to pay those, make the car payments, right?
Period of almost 25 to 30 years, a sedan, the price of sedan has only doubled because in the 80s, Corolla would be $8,000, $9,000. Now it's $15,000. Little bit high grade sedan like the Casita they have, it was like 14, 15,000 now. It's comparable to Camry, 22, 23,000. I mean, it seems the rise in price is very, it's very low.
Yeah. Well, it is an area where there was a lot of productivity. There increases in terms of robotics and so on and so forth. Upgrading to the most advanced machine tools. The Japanese led the way. There's also the busting of the unions. Wage levels came way down. Auto plants moved into the south of the United States, for example, where wages are far less. Or out of the United States. Well, also though, I mean, look, General Motors sold 2 million cars in China last year. Ford sold 1 million.
China is the biggest market, over 20 million. We're only like 17 million.
Yeah. Anyway, yes, the maquiladoras in Mexico, yeah, sure, all that stuff. Yeah, that cheapened the cost of of the components that went into the cars.
How much your car costs?
Let's look at
Price
railroads.
of cars and price of houses, I think it's cheapest in the US compared to other industries.
Houses.
No, I
Yeah.
mean, it's in the south. Even in London, houses cost you.
Well, in a sane world, you would want the prices of houses and homes not to just come down once, but you want the price of those goods, right, over time, over decades, to keep coming down, right, to make us.
During World War II, my parents spent $5,000 on a house on a half-acre.
Yeah, my dad when he got married had I think he had 3 cars, and he was driving a lumber truck, I mean. Huh?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
My father-in-law's first house cost $10,000.
Yeah. The first homes my dad built as a home builder were $14,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the early, mid 60s or something.
And it was a big house.
Yeah.
With everything you tried to drive costs down, you put into the production, the price is going up. So the differential is all the financial.
I'm not understanding the
You
question.
said they broke unions, they moved down to the south, they, did various things that decreased the expenses for producing autos.
Right.
You said?
Yeah, in response to his point, which was he's surprised that auto prices haven't gone up higher. Yeah, he was saying why haven't auto prices gone up as much as some other things have gone up since the 1980s, over a period of 30, 35 years. And with inflation and all the other, and so I was trying to answer, I'm trying to answer, they're definitely, these are elements of the answer. Yeah. So they've been continuing outside of, certain bailout programs carried out on Obama, one-time bailout operations to the auto industry, in the 2007, 2008 financial crash period. Wall Street's, has continued to make their money off of, off the auto industry.
All the new programs that Obama tried to introduce, Wall Street was the beneficiary.
Yep.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Some people got a cheap refrigerator or something. So just to then complete, I mean, so exactly what was done with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, in which you're tying loans or new loans on top of old loans, but you're tying it to productive outcomes, right, is exactly what you can do to institute an economic recovery now. And so you have LaRouche's proposal, longstanding proposal over the last several years, of creating a national bank to finance, to do what the Reconstruction Finance Corporation did, to essentially be a credit bank. And as somebody asked me the other day, doing a show up in Dearborn, well, China has several of these policy banks, 3 major policy banks. Couldn't there be more than one national bank? You know, theoretically, yeah, you could. I mean, you could have 12 credit banks. You know, that's what Roosevelt was proposing. I mean, not to just kind of throw these things around, but you obviously want to guide the economy overall. So you want to send a major central bank, not central in terms of central to everything, to the economy, to organize it overall. But that bank could have branches as well. But the point is that a national bank can be created, and how do you capitalize that bank? In the case of what was done with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the monies came directly from the U.S. government, you know, and of course then also the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, for example, printed Federal Reserve banknotes alongside Federal Reserve notes. Federal Reserve banknotes, the money that the Fed printed to resuscitate banks under the new guidelines that were put in place under the Industries Act. So we now have a situation, just to give you some ideas, you know that the Chinese and the Japanese are willing to put money into capitalize a bank. That's becoming a more thought-provoking idea. Paul Gallagher was reporting on that in terms of the organizing up on Capitol Hill this last week, that people were listening for the first time, really getting what he was saying because of the hurricanes and because of how are we going to rebuild. Right? I mean, if you notice right now, if you read the Houston media, suddenly nobody's talking about building big canals or the Ike Dike, or there's no, you know, it's there in the background because it was being talked about a couple weeks ago. But there's not right now, you know, it's just recovery type stuff. You know, it's because there's a kind of paralysis at the moment. How are we going to go forward on this? So
there's no congressional town meeting where Congressman actually makes a proposal how to do it.
Yeah. So this idea of capitalizing a national bank using Chinese and Japanese holdings of U.S. debt, you know, and putting it in the bank, you know, think of it, it's ironic, right? We owe them. That's what a U.S. government bond is. We owe the holder, right? Then they put it back in to our bank, into a national bank, and then we lend against that. What are we lending against? We're lending against our own future capacity to produce as a nation. We know that if we direct this to these kinds of infrastructure projects, that will return not only the payment of the loan, but will allow the retirement of the U.S. government bond that was originally issued. Right?
Is that an actual discussion that's published somewhere that we could reference?
Well, there's several ways it's coming up now. The original was back in January 2nd of this year. The Chinese Investment Corporation, their CEO in Hong Kong, proposed that they would prefer and they would like to put a chunk of their holdings of U.S. government debt, U.S. Treasury bonds, into U.S. infrastructure. So that's this kind of standing opening, and that may be part of the discussion process that's going on with Wilbur Ross and the Chinese and the Trump administration and so on.
That was the Chinese, what was it called, Brian?
Chinese Investment Corporation, which is one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds. It holds about $1 trillion. I think it's a little less, 870 billion or something like that. You know, in other words, the government of China has all this foreign exchange surplus. So they gave it to the sovereign wealth fund to manage. So the sovereign wealth fund manages a portion of China's, you know, reserves, which is about 3 trillion plus total. But they manage about 800 billion of that, 870 billion. And so the head of the CIC was, you know, obviously he reports to the state council. I mean, he reports directly to the people running the show, you know, their day to day, like reporting to the cabinet is a rough approximation. So he's not just speaking for himself. This isn't some idea, you know, of his. This is obviously the Chinese government speaking directly. So that's on the table. You even had a proposal. Fox News carried the article. The solution to America's infrastructure problem could lie in the Fed's bloated balance sheet. And this proposal is that that the Federal Reserve, that holds approximately $4 trillion in government bonds and toxic financial paper that they bought off the books of the banks and otherwise bought from the U.S. government, you know, in exchange for printing money, that the U.S. Fed put, you know, say $1 trillion of its holdings of this financial paper into a bank, a you know, national bank, and to finance infrastructure. This is being made by a guy named Don Schreiber of WBI Investments. So yeah, I mean, so there's this discussion. I mean, in other words, this idea of capitalizing debt is in circulation and in discussion. Paul Gallagher brought this up, and it was in Daily Alert. It was mentioned at the end of I don't know.
So that term, capitalizing debt, I think really is so important, and that you redefine it, because you just gave an example that should be cause optimism for people, that here's the head of this Chinese investment corporation saying, you owe us so much money, but we're willing to take that, put it in our bank and give it back to you to build infrastructure.
Right, and they'll make money on that, and they'll make more money than they will just having a U.S. Treasury note. You know? They'll make 5% or 4% as opposed to 1%.
So that's an example of, because I never liked that term, capitalizing debt.
Yeah, well, but it's ironic.
Yeah, so that would be considered a concrete example of capitalizing debt.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so important for our listeners to know that. Yeah.
What Hamilton did with the American Revolutionary debt.
Yeah. Yeah. The National Bank of the United States was Hamilton, you know, with authorization of the Congress, through the National Bank, not just proposing, but saying, come to us with your war debt. Come to with your debt, your continentals, you know, not worth a continental, you know, with your continental money. Come to us with the IOUs, the debt, the script that was written to take your cows, you know, to feed the army, you know, whatever grant, you know, the state debt, states had issued various forms of debt to maintain their own activities, and it circulated and it become virtually worthless. He said, bring it all to the National Bank, and we'll, and in exchange for it, we can give you land. If you want to start a farm, you know, at a certain rate or whatever, we'll give you land. Or you can take some land and you'll take some of these new, this new currency we're printing, the National Bank currency, U.S. National Bank currency.
Didn't that have the bank share?
Yeah, I guess that's right. I mean, technically, and then it circulated as currency. You bought shares, you got shares in the bank, and then the shares in the bank circulated as currency. And so people brought all this stuff in, exchanged it, so now suddenly the country had currency. And what made it not just a scam, you know, not just a paper shuffling operation, was that there was a revenue stream. It was tariffs on imported whiskey and other liquor was dedicated to servicing you know, the bank shares, you know, that paid 4 or 5%. You know, so it was debt, IOUs that were taken in, and that was then the capital of the bank. And they issued these paper, and the paper circulated to do what? Increase the productive activity of the whole country. And in the
catalog, what they would take in the report on the National Bank.
Mhm.
And it just says, here's how we're going to give you your share.
you can take it this way, or you can take it this way. There's all these
About
different.
20 different options.
So it's in the currency. We should really be, as Louise said, optimistic about this conceptually, but also have a sense that this is, you know, is in currency itself. The idea that we really can promote this, you know, amplify this, keep amplifying this outward right now, because we're now at a moment where really the whole country, or at least the policy-making circles in the country, are riveted on this question of what is a mechanism, what is the financial mechanism that we need? PPPs don't work, Wall Street, that doesn't work. Okay, so where's the money? The government? Are we just going to print money and create more debt? You know, no, the government's already up to its eyeballs with debt, with all these wars and everything over the last, you know, 16 years. So, so how do we do it? Without, you know, so Hamiltonian banking, national banking.
What do you say to people? Well, 1790 and 1944, that was a totally different time. You know, what makes you think we should do the same thing now that we do that? I mean,
what comes to mind is Lyndon LaRouche's answer to that some years ago was, you know, people say you can't put toothpaste back in the tube. You know, he said it in terms of how the economy had become this speculative derivatives economy and so forth. And he said, no, we got to be back to a productive economy, industry. And so the people would say, no, you can't do that. That's gone. You know, the rust bucket is the rust bucket belt, you know, and we can't rebuild. And he said, yes, you can. You can put toothpaste back in the tube. You just cut off the end, you know, right? And take a, you know, a knife or something and open it up in there, and you can stuff the toothpaste back in there, and then you can roll it up again. I mean, you know, you can put toothpaste back in the tube, but, you know, and the opposite.
The way the Wall Street.
Oh yeah, their way. Yeah. Yeah, you're talking about the end of the United States. I mean, it's a parasitical process.
The presidential debates, I think Bernie Sanders mentioned there, like 60,000 industries closed. 60,000.
Yeah, you have to have both ways. Well, he's totally. Well, he's the last year. He does probably, but he doesn't.
Well, you know, what you see, right, is you see this, there's an agreement or a consensus emerging above the parties.
Yeah.
In terms of the base supporters of Sanders, often were like the supporters of Trump. You know, they had different social, you know, whatever, cultural, you know, views or whatever. But in terms of, yeah, but they were, you know, they were out to bust Wall Street, you know, stick it to Wall Street, you know, and it had some sense that you had to address the actual needs of the nation, of the people. So, you know, what Sanders, he came on board on Glass-Steagall, endorsed it. Trump endorsed Glass-Steagall. You know, the point is that the actual emerging truth of the matter is that only the American system works. Hamiltonian economics works, and that's where the convergence is. Not necessarily that they get there automatically, but with our help, we can get everybody there, most people. And that's why the Mueller report is so important, is to free people up so they can do that. So, I'm sorry.
So there is no such bank or financial support institution run by the government. What about Exim Bank? What about SBA loans?
Well, Exim Bank right now basically doesn't, you know, it doesn't exist. I mean, it's not funded right now. It could get funded, and that could play a role. You know, China has its policy bank, the Exim Bank. Huh? Yeah, yeah, it's there on paper. That's what I was saying, but it's not, you know, it's not funded.
I wanna start an enterprise.
It was seen as government interference in the markets.
But if I wanna like start an enterprise, you know, something productive,
Mm-hmm.
so I have to, only option is to go to the private bank. Of course, I can get crowdfunding or, you know, not hedge funds, what's that, others, financial resources. The government doesn't have anything.
Borrow from your local drug dealer. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll call check.
Right, right.
Government, in China, you know, I have seen a foreman of a factory, and he has got some experience. He went and borrowed and he built his own factory.
Yeah.
In China.
In China.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been there 5-6 times. They have this trade fair in February and October. And every time I go, I see new industries have come up and they're in the fair. You know?
Right, but you can go from nothing to be a gigantic company.
As long as you
in 2
have
years, if
gathered
you know what
that
you're doing, right?
expertise, the government gives you a, you know, it
Access to
provides
credit.
everything.
Mhm. Yeah.
So you become productive.
Yeah.
Well, it just take an act of Congress to turn the Fed into a national bank.
Right. You know, it's a direction, right? If there's an agreement. Right now, all you have is these push button issues and factionalization and squabbling over little stuff, you know, whether it's healthcare or tax rates or this stuff. But that's the difference now is you know, this crisis, you know, which has been amplified by Hurricane Irma and Harvey and the rest is
Interest rate,
pressing this
in
forward.
Japan, you have a small shock. Interest rate in Japan is probably 2% at the most. And over here, even if you buy a motel and there is an SBA element to your loan, you cannot get anything under 5%, 6%. So it gives a tremendous leverage to entrepreneurs.
Sure.
You know, to be able to borrow at that rate.
Sure. Well, you know, China has, you know, they in 1993 implemented Glass-Steagall. They implemented, you know, Glass-Steagall in their country, and they don't have a Federal Reserve. They decided not to have a Federal Reserve system. Instead, the decisions are made from the State Council down through institutions like the, you know, central bank and so forth. And so the credit is directed from, as a policy measure, directed by the government itself. It's not left to the magic of the marketplace somehow out there. So the government of China has determined that long-term low-interest credits are available, and that innovation, as Xi Jinping is emphasizing again and again and again, innovation is the watchword for China today. And so innovation requires, you know, a lot of credits being available to entrepreneurs.
Japan, China, I think interest rate is a little bit higher, but
But it's available, right? And because of the general environment, 3%, 4% isn't bad because, you know, you can generate a profitability that allows you to service that.
someone is struggling to pay back, give some sort of moratorium, okay, on the debt, you know, okay, you are allowed. So not many companies, I mean, industries, small industries.
Yeah, they want you to succeed. Yeah. Yeah, and you can see that's what was happening in the Roosevelt administration. They were trying to help people succeed, you know, as opposed to just collect whatever was owed. Okay?
Yeah.
Good. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.